This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and at 14 hours GMT on Wednesday the 2nd of January, these are our main stories. 2 Indian women have made history by entering a Hindu temple once forbidden to females between the ages of 10 to 50. A train crash in Denmark has left at least 6 people dead. We'll find out how it happened. Also,
children are consuming too much sugar, and that increases the risk of tooth decay and weight gain and obesity, which leads to serious diseases in adults.
In Britain, a new report has worrying findings about children's diet. Also in this podcast, how the Taliban carried out an audacious attack on an Afghan army base by first digging a tunnel underneath it. And
Ia te Michael Williams, wagli besene radio pai makdai jala hanumang sene azligo hube.
One of 11 indigenous languages spoken in Guyana will have a report on efforts being made to preserve them with support from the UN. A court ruling in India which allows women of menstruating age to enter a Hindu temple has led to 2 women making history by becoming the first to worship there. The issue has caused huge protests in support of and against females being allowed to enter the temple in the southern state of Kerala. Here's the women's rights activist Trupti Desai.
The entry of women in the temple today is a historic win for us. It's a victory for equality, and it's a victory for women, because after the verdict of the Supreme Court, the protesters were opposing the entry of women, and today that protest has become unsuccessful.
I asked our South Asia editor Jill McGivering about the continuing protests.
Yes, perhaps not surprising that, in a sense, the Conservatives who are so angrily opposed to women entering the temple were slightly, I think, taken by surprise, because previously women have gone in daylight in quite a public way and they've been blocked. This time they went in wearing black under the cover of darkness, and they went a much less known route, so they sort of went secretly, really. But since news has broken about it, clearly there's been a lot of anger, and those who are opposed to women entering the shrine have staged various protests, including some outside the parliamentary buildings in Kerala. And there have been clashes with police. We understand they've used tear gas and water cannon to try and stop the protests and clashes.
And tell us more about the background to this, why women are not allowed to enter.
Well, it's a very long-standing religious tradition. In many places, in many temples in India, if you are menstruating, you're asked not to visit. There's a sense that women who are menstruating are unclean or impure. But it's less usual that all women are banned when they're of menstruating age, which is the case here. And the argument has always been from the Conservatives that it is their religious right, it is part of their religious freedom to make that decision because they feel it's inappropriate, it would anger the deity. So it's been a very long-standing tradition, but it's one of these issues where we've got tradition in India and the Conservatives not wanting change coming directly into conflict with a more liberal, often more urbanised set of values. And we saw the ruling on that with the Supreme Court in September, but the issue hasn't really been resolved because although in theory women won the right, as we're hearing, it's been very difficult for them to exercise that right, and still unclear if other women will be able to in the future.
So what do you think will happen now, because it's hotly contested on both sides?
Absolutely. I don't think this is going to go away. There is another hearing, another petition that will be heard by the Supreme Court later this month, so we may see a further development in the legal battle. In the short term, clearly protests, and then the issue will be, I think, whether any other women are able to access it again, or whether security is made so tight by those who are opposed to their entering the temple that this is a one-off.
Jill McGivering, our South Asia editor. A train crash in Denmark has left at least 6 people dead and 16 others injured. The incident took place on the Great Belt Bridge connecting the Danish islands of Zealand and Funen, which has now been shut. This passenger, Heidi, explained what happened.
We're shocked. Where we were sitting, we were lucky. The passengers in the next carriage were not so fortunate. So for us it was a shock with broken glass and some blood. The others, unfortunately, they weren't so lucky.
The passenger train was hit by objects from a freight train, and a storm has been making it difficult for emergency services to reach the train on the Great Belt Bridge. Anders Kongshaug is a local journalist in Copenhagen, where the passenger train was heading.
This is by far the most important bridge in Denmark. It's connecting east and west. It's about 10 miles long, and the hanging bridge is about 1.6 miles long, and that's where the accident happened. And it was a Carlsberg wagon filled with Carlsberg beers where the roof blew off and beers fell off, and that's what actually hit the train. It's really serious. It's not very often the bridge is closed because it's so important. There's 10 million cars driving every year there. 9 million is personal cars, and then at this hour, most of them are wagon cars because of the season. So there's a lineup of wagons there right now. It's a big accident here. There's a crisis center being established on one of the sides of the bridge, and everything is being established right now, and people are getting notified. And there's a strong wind here, and actually the bridge was also closed for local traffic during the night. All bridges here was pretty much closed, but then it was opened up at 9:30 UK time, and then the accident happened.
Danish journalist Anders Kongshaug. Researchers here in the UK have discovered that the country's children are, on average, consuming more than 130 kilograms of sugar by the age of 10. Public Health England, a body that advises the government on health issues, says this means the average 10-year-old has eaten as much sugar in their lifetime as the recommended limit for an 18-year-old. Dr Alison Tedston is Chief Nutritionist at Public Health England.
We've seen this consistent pattern, though, that our children are consuming too much sugar, and that increases the risk of tooth decay and weight gain and obesity, which leads to serious diseases in adults.
The organisation is urging parents to switch to lower sugar drinks and cereals. It's also calling on the food industry to do its part. Tim Rycroft is Chief Operating Officer at the Food and Drink Federation.
It's clear that we're all eating too much sugar. So today's initiative from Public Health England, I think, is welcome in that it's giving good objective advice to people on how they can make more informed, positive diet choices. I'm disappointed that the focus is again just on sugar, the role of one nutrient in the diet, when we would prefer to see a focus on the whole diet and the role of calories in, calories out.
Our health and science correspondent James Gallagher has more.
The recommendation is around about 5 cubes of sugar a day. It changes as you get a little bit older. But for children, it's around about 5 cubes of sugar a day. In reality, children are consuming 13. So when you add all that up, the amount of sugar you should reach by 18, well, you've wolfed that down by the time your children are 10. Now, the biggest impact on children during their childhoods is on their teeth. The most common reason for 5 to 9-year-olds to be in hospital is to have a tooth removed. Public Health England says that a tooth is removed every 10 minutes in England in hospital because of children eating too much sugar. But in the long run, it has bigger health consequences too. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, increasing the risk of some cancers and heart disease. And that is why Public Health England is encouraging parents in the new year as part of its Change for Life campaign to get their children to eat less sugar. There has been a target, which is for next year, for the food industry to reduce by a fifth the amount of sugar in many of its foods which are very popular with children, things like some cakes and biscuits, ice creams. Now, there has been a lot of mood music going on in the background, basically saying if there isn't enough action taken, then what's going to happen is that government will have to act more strongly. And that is where all this talk about whether you need a pudding tax, whether you need to expand the sugar levy which applies to soft drinks, whether those kinds of measures are going to have to be expanded to basically stop the sugar getting into children's food in the first place if manufacturers don't do it.
James Gallagher, our health and science correspondent. China's government aims to create a personal credit score for every citizen by the year 2020. The idea is to track each individual's positive and negative contribution to society and to punish or reward them accordingly. But concerns have been raised over the idea of a person's every action being eventually recorded, judged and ranked. The scheme is still at trial stage, involving small local monitoring projects rather than one centralised tracking operation. And our China correspondent John Sudworth has been to see one pilot project in action.
China is a country that has combined high-tech with political control like no other. And now, the mass collection of data even has its own theme song. This modern-day revolutionary ode is a tribute to the eastern city of Rongcheng, a leading light of China's experiment with social credit. We do volunteer work, the lyrics go. Love prevails everywhere. Rongcheng is now a place where your positive deeds, your volunteer work, as well as your negative actions are recorded in a giant database, and everyone is given an individual score. In a government building, we watch as a steady stream of people come in to find out their own score. Every citizen starts with 1,000 points, an A rating. They can progress to AA or even AAA if they gain more points, or fall as low as a D rating if they lose them. So this man's checking to see what his social credit score is. Wow, look at that. So a score of 1,065. You've earned an extra 65 points. You can see the extra activities here. His paper printout lists his community work, shoveling snow, helping the poor and the needy. The high score he has means he now qualifies for free medical checkups. Points are mainly docked for law breaking. A minor traffic offence costs you 5 points, for example. Negative scores can have very serious consequences, though. They can stop you getting a bank loan or prevent you from applying for certain jobs. Elsewhere in China, a kind of digital shaming is being tested out. Debt defaulters can be forced to have special ringtones installed on their mobile phones. The person you're calling hasn't paid their debts, the message says. Please urge them to fulfill their legal duty. On one level, China's fledgling social credit system is simply an attempt to restore trust in a system that badly lacks it, adding a social dimension to the consequences of breaking laws or ignoring regulations. In a Rongcheng restaurant, diners are dipping raw fish into simmering pots of soup.
My name is Zhang Xianhao. I am the manager of this fish restaurant.
So this is the kitchen here of the award-winning social credit restaurant. So tell me, when the inspectors come, what kind of things are they looking for?
The hygiene issue is the most important thing, and they have to make sure the raw food and the cooked food are separated. If I want to apply for a new restaurant due to my good social credit, we can get it easier.
China's experiment with social credit is still very much at the design phase. Some experts have raised doubts about the technical challenge of scaling up these pilot projects into a national scheme with an individual score for 1.3 billion people. But it should come as no surprise that the ways in which big data can be used to control and modify people's behaviour are being explored by a government that wants, above all else, to stay in power.
That report by John Sudworth. Still to come in this podcast.
There was widespread celebration as the country welcomed Cyril Ramaphosa. But in many ways, he inherited a poisoned chalice, a disillusioned population, a corrupt government, and a struggling economy.
South Africa saw a change of leadership last year, but as we'll hear, it still faces enormous challenges. In Afghanistan, the Taliban have attacked an army base in the south of the country by digging an 800-metre-long tunnel underneath it and detonating explosives. Officials say 6 members of the security forces died. For more on this brazen attack, I spoke to our correspondent in Kabul, Aulia Atrafi.
Absolutely extraordinary does seem to be the word. They must have used some sort of digging technology to dig it. But the extraordinary thing is also how the Afghan National Army base in question didn't notice all this going on, because according to the local knowledge, this digging must have been going on at least for 1 month. So this thing has been going on, and last night, 11 o'clock-ish, the Taliban put some explosives literally under the base, blew it up, and at the same time attacked the nearby other bases. So the fighting went on.
And what's been reaction to this? Because as you say, it's extraordinary that it wasn't noticed what they were planning to do.
Absolutely. Huge criticism from the Kandahar police. This thing has been going on for a long time, according to them, that the Afghan army is not taking the fight to the Taliban, and that it's the police who are leaving their bases, the patrolling, sometimes penetrating the Taliban territory. So then the Taliban don't dare do such a thing to them, but it keeps happening to the Afghan National Army.
And it comes, doesn't it, Arya, amid fresh hopes, really, of a negotiated settlement. Will these attacks have any effect?
No, rather the contrary. Both sides are trying to put as much pressure as possible on the other side to give them more leverage in the negotiation and to come from a strong position. And both parties feel the need for that, especially the Afghan government feels the need to talk from a position of strength. So the acting defense ministry, who took his position this week, he has been saying that we will come out of this defensive position and adopt more of an aggressive approach.
Alia Atrafi, our correspondent in Kabul. Right now in South Africa, it's the height of summer, and after a year of political turmoil and drama, what are people there hoping for in 2019? The BBC's Pumza Filani looks back at the year that's just ended and what this new year might bring.
No leader should stay beyond the time determined by the people they serve. I have therefore come to the decision to resign as President of the Republic with immediate effect.
That was South Africa's former president, Jacob Zuma, who in the dead of night on Valentine's Day announced his resignation. We spent hours at the Union Buildings, the seat of government in the capital, Pretoria, waiting for any sign of what Mr. Zuma's next move would be.
As President of the Republic of South Africa, I, Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, swear that I will be faithful to the Republic of South Africa.
And with that, South Africa had a new president. There was widespread celebration as the country welcomed Cyril Ramaphosa. But in many ways, he inherited a poisoned chalice, a disillusioned population, a corrupt government, and a struggling economy. 2018 also marked the end of an era when apartheid struggle stalwart and Nelson Mandela's ex-wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, died. Unlike her former husband, who rightly or wrongly has been immortalized in history as a hero, Ms. Madikizela Mandela has a complex legacy. To some, she was a villain, a woman who made questionable and at times dangerous decisions, and she did. But having followed her political life, I believe Ms. Madikizela Mandela was no one thing.
Let's sing together Mama's favorite hymn, Zulu Yemfihlakalo, Zulu Yesma.
Still, millions loved her. Her death gave birth to a new generation of activists who coined the phrase, Winnie did not die, she multiplied. They say they want to honor her legacy by fighting for women's rights here.
Women are being turned away from police stations and they are told to handle it within the family. And those things are the things that we want the country to know. We want the president to do something about it.
And then the sound of anger. South Africa's women marched on the government calling for an end to violence against women. It is sadly all too easy for women to be abused or die from violence here. The country has one of the highest rape figures in the world. More than 30,000 cases are reported each year. In August, their discontent could be felt. Dressed mainly in black, carrying placards with messages such as, "No one asked what my rapist was wearing," women from across the country marched to government institutions to deliver a memorandum of demands. South Africa goes to the polls in the first half of 2019. The stakes are high, especially with some political parties calling for a more hardline approach to addressing persistent inequality here. South Africa remains a highly politicized country, and the strength of its democracy will be tested in how its people deal with dissent and discontent ahead of the election. And that is a story I look forward to telling.
That postcard from South Africa was by Pomza Felani. Sudan is reportedly sending child soldiers to Yemen to fight in the civil war there. The Sudanese soldiers are part of a Saudi-led coalition which has been supporting the government against Houthi rebels who seized control of much of the country. David Kirkpatrick, a New York Times journalist, recently discovered that fighters under the age of 18 are amongst the Sudanese troops being shipped off to Yemen, and he told Shama Khalil more about his findings.
Sudan is one of several countries listed as parts of a Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen, fighting against a faction there allied with Iran, the Houthis. Of that coalition, the Sudanese appear to be the most numerous on the ground. That is, aside from the local Yemeni militias, the most numerous soldiers are the ones from Sudan. I went to Khartoum to try to find out what their experience was like and why they were going.
Tell us about the makeup of the soldiers, of the fighters that are on the ground in Yemen. Who are they?
There was a civil war in the Darfur region of Sudan. One side of that civil war was known as the Janjaweed militia, a tribal militia based in Darfur. That's been reconstituted and formalized as a paramilitary outfit known as the Rapid Support Forces. That's who's fighting in Yemen. Basically, the militia previously known as the Janjaweed are being flown from Darfur or from Khartoum to Saudi Arabia and deploying from there into Yemen on behalf of the Saudi-led coalition.
And it's interesting, though, what you write in this story about how the fighters, the Sudanese fighters on the ground, are basically being treated as a commodity, that they're being exchanged for foreign currency, and that the money, the Saudis and the Emiratis that they're paying, it goes directly to the fighters. It doesn't go into the Sudanese economy.
Yeah, that's right. I expected that Saudi Arabia would be providing aid to Sudan, and in exchange for that aid, Sudan would be deploying its military. Pakistan, for example, which receives quite a bit of Saudi aid, has deployed about 1,000 soldiers inside the Saudi border to try to support the war effort. That's not the case in Sudan. In fact, the Sudanese government and the Sudanese economy is teetering very near the edge of collapse, and they are not getting significant help from Saudi Arabia or any other Gulf country. It appears the only help they are getting is the hard currency flowing to the families of those soldiers. So Sudanese who are critical of this say these are basically mercenaries and that their country is selling its young fighters in exchange for foreign currency, for revenue.
Let's talk about young fighters. How did you discover the presence of child soldiers then among the Sudanese troops in Yemen?
I was trying to speak with veterans, Sudanese veterans of the war in Yemen, and it hadn't occurred to me that there would be children among them, but several of them mentioned that quite a few in their units, they're divided into units of about 700, that quite a few of them were under the age of 18. That was striking to me, obviously, because these are young people who've grown up in a fairly dire civil war, and now they're being plopped into the middle of another civil war about 1,200 miles away.
What have the Sudanese and the Saudi governments, for that matter, been saying about your findings, about child soldiers on the front line?
Well, the Sudanese government was not very responsive when I was asking questions about this in advance. They put me in touch ultimately with a spokesman for the foreign ministry who said he couldn't talk about the soldiers. The Saudi spokesman for the whole coalition said sweepingly that they uphold all human rights and humanitarian laws, including refraining from the recruitment of child soldiers. So speaking on behalf of the coalition, he says they are not recruiting child soldiers.
David Kirkpatrick, a journalist with the New York Times, speaking there to Shama Khalil. The United Nations Cultural Organization, UNESCO, is calling 2019 the Year of Indigenous Languages. It's a bid to protect and revitalise endangered languages around the world. Guyana in South America has 11 indigenous languages, and local communities in the country have in the recent past rushed to learn English to avoid being marginalised. But that seems to be changing. Karina Sharples compiled this report.
Kamiarmang, yede magri Michael Williams, wagri besene radio pay makdai jara hanmang sene azli ko hbe. Good morning. My name is Michael Williams and welcome to Radio Paimak 97.1. I am one of the 4 broadcasters here at Radio Paimak 97.1 BNFM.
Radio Paiwamak is Guyana's first community radio station and has been broadcasting for 18 years in both English and Makushi, a language listed by UNESCO as vulnerable.
We are Makushi people here. So for the elders to understand, let's say like news, we do that in Makushi so that they would understand what is happening in Guyana or in the region or even up here.
Makushi is just one of 9 indigenous languages in Guyana. Melissa and her 83-year-old grandmother Helena speak Akawayo.
I feel so proud that I learned Akawayo. My mom had resided out here in Georgetown. She never speak to me in Akawayo. But so luckily to have a grandmother because she doesn't understand English. So it was helpful for me to be around her so that I can translate for her.
Does she feel that she's missed out not speaking English?
She said at first, growing up, she used to feel left out. She felt a way that she didn't get an opportunity to go to school, to learn some things. But at the same time now, as she gets older, she accepts that.
Today, Indigenous children in Guyana have growing opportunities to learn in their native tongue. Paulette Alicock is a coordinator of the Makushi Research Unit and teaches the language at a school in Anai.
I do different things. We do theory and practical. And then I would bring them to Radio Paiwamak to hear their voice, to tell the people them how far they are with the language.
Angeline Gomes is a former student of the Makushi class. How important is language to you as an Indigenous person, to your identity?
Well, language to my identity is critically important. I would go to my grandmother for her to teach me daily. She would laugh at me, and when I make mistakes, correct me there and then. So it's like connecting with other people.
This country that people always describe as the only English-speaking country in South America is really a multilingual country.
Charlene Wilkinson is a language activist at the University of Guyana who campaigns for greater inclusion of the 11 different tongues spoken around the country.
English is held up as the language of power, the most desired language, and there is still some resistance in the education system against recognizing and validating the other languages. But I feel very optimistic that we will move towards greater and greater inclusion of these languages in the school curricula.
Language activist Charlene Wilkinson ending that report from Guyana by our correspondent Carinya Sharples. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, bye-bye.